Hello, Wine How family. It was Halloween night of 2007 freshman year in high school, and I was with my friends Ivan, Ryan, and Jesse, who were all dressed as in Super Mario characters. I was Luigi since I was the second tallest. Ivan was Mario since he's short and buff. Not that Mario was buff. Jesse was Luigi because he's freakishly tall and skinny, and Ryan was Mario because he's just really fat, so they were the perfect group costumes for us. We live in a very non-congested neighborhood with a decent amount of space in between houses. On Halloween, that's the worst thing. Ever less bang for your buck. We were trick-or-treating for hours, way past dark, and eventually came the time when most trick-or-treaters were heading home. My feet started to hurt, and I had to constantly switch arms from holding the now 10-pound pillow sack of candy, but we planned on getting until our bags were completely filled. A lot of houses by now weren't answering anymore, as it was probably past their cutoff time for giving candy to trick-or-treaters. Approaching our next house, we saw a purple bucket on the stoop that was the best feeling ever. I was like the one to get close enough to realize it was empty, which was the worst feeling ever. I turned around when I heard a knock at the window of the house. We all looked at the window, couldn't see anyone, but heard someone call out, "Wait!" The door opened, and an older man, late 40s, already bolting, stepped outside. He told us to come inside so we can get some more candy. I said we could just wait out here, where he responded saying something along the lines of, "Nonsense, come on in, we'll get you more candy." Ivan stepped in and said, "It's all right, come on Dan, let's go." I told the guy to take care and apologized. He just stood there watching as we walked off, not saying anything. I felt bad, but at the same time that guy appeared to be creepy, and I figured I just dodged a bullet not going in there. If the story ended there, it wouldn't be so scary, so of course it didn't end there, and we skipped a few of the guy's neighboring houses just to get further away and continued on with our business. We were walking down close to Nature Preserve now, so there weren't many houses around us, and at that point we were now walking back closer to Jesse's house. I noticed Ryan had stopped walking, and I turned around to see what was up, and he said he heard someone moving from behind the trees in the preserve. Now, this was before everyone's phones had flashlights, so we couldn't just go searching in the woods for someone. Besides, we were just telling Ryan that it must have been a raccoon or something. You may think that it's a bit cliche, but when things like this happen in real life, you always assume the more logical possibility. It's just natural. Why would we assume we were being followed? I had to put my arm around Ryan's shoulder, nudge him forward a little ways down the street, and I had picked up on the sound as well. When all stopped, the sounds of the footsteps from beyond the trees stopped as well. Ivan yelled at the obvious stalker to go away or we would beat the shit out of him. I knew he was just bluffing, though. I could hear the nervousness in his voice. The snap of a twig from beyond the trees triggered a fight or flight response in all of us. Me, Jesse, and Ryan all ran for it. Ivan was at first charging to attack, but he quickly followed after, realizing we were all taken off. We ran down that dark street, and we all noticed the sounds of at least 2 or 3 pairs of footsteps crushing the twigs and leaves in the woods. We banked it hard right down Jesse Street when it finally came up and ran straight for his backyard, entering his house through the back door. The first thing we did was peek out through his living room window, and we couldn't see anyone, so we all had to gather our thoughts and discuss what the hell just happened in the living room when all of a sudden we heard Jesse's backyard gate slam shut. Jesse dove to turn off the lights. There was a click and a bang from down in the den. It was more than likely Jesse's back door. We all agreed to go down armed with knives and face them. Jesse turned on his back door light, but there was nobody out there. Just when the front door opened and we all screamed like animals, Jesse's mom and sisters came rushing downstairs. They had just gotten home from their friend's little house party. We all rested ashore, knowing it was just them. Jesse explained what happened, but made it seem a lot less dramatic. Me and Ivan went home after that and called it a night at 12:30 a.m. I got a disturbing text message. It was from Jesse. It said, "It wasn't my mom." I texted back saying, "What?" He responded back quickly saying it wasn't my mom in the backyard. My finger slammed the buttons on my phone, responding back, "What do you need?" There was a long pause before he finally told me that his mom and sister said they never went in the backyard. I told him to immediately check the backyard from his upper deck. He had already done just that. He also told his mom everything, and she had already called the police. They didn't find anyone back there, but Jesse did mention the guy who invited us in while trick-or-treating. Nothing ever became of that, and nothing ever happened at Jesse's house again after that one Halloween night. Hello again. Me and my best friend Jordan and my friend Chris were trick-or-treating on Halloween night. We live in a really rural side of Pennsylvania, and Halloween always kind of sucked because of that. For all you city and urban kids, Halloween is a lot different when you live in a quiet rural area. First of all, and most obviously, the walking distance between houses is much worse. However, people tend to give more candy to us since they get less trick-or-treaters. And that's the second thing, less trick-or-treaters. It's actually kind of rare to see any other people trick-or-treating by us, mainly because we live in the middle of East, so it didn't feel as festive lore, just Halloweenish. I'll tell you right now, it felt a lot spookier, though, walking down four-stay roads all alone with your group, only with the occasional house. And for that, maybe it was the perfect place for Halloween. It was our first house of the night. I remember the kind old man who answered had a huge bowl of Kit Kats and Snickers. He poured at least a pound of candy into each one of our bags. It was great. Our next house was quite some hike away, but once again, the woman who answered was very friendly and gave a very generous amount of candy. After about 6 houses, our bags were starting to get heavy, but you have to realize it took almost half an hour to hit those 6 houses, so we reached the entrance of the dirt road leading to smaller houses and trailer homes, and the first 2 houses on this dirt road we tried didn't answer, so we decided to try one more on this road before turning around to find another area. We reached the very appropriately eerie property of a smaller house along a dirt path. The whole front yard had an orange glow because of the 4 torches that were lit up leading up to the front porch. There was an orange bowl on the stoop decorated with black silhouettes of witches, pumpkins, and other Halloween themes. Besides 2 straight Tootsie Rolls, the bowl was empty. There was a sign on the door that read, "If there is no more candy, enter the back at your own risk for more." Under that, there was an evil-looking smiley face along with an arrow pointing to the backyard. Chris said, "Let's just turn around and go back," but Jordan and I wanted to go around back. It seemed interesting, as if they had something cool set up. Chris had no choice but to follow us around the house of the backyard, which was a small clearing from the miles of forest that surrounded the backyard. Was lit up orange as well, but not as brightly. There was a single torch that sat in the middle of the small yard. It provided enough orange light to see a note on the back door. We got closer to the back door and read the note, and it was some kind of riddle. It said, "If candy is what you desire, then you have to look closer to the fire." And yes, I still remember that stupid riddle to this day. So of course we assumed that by the fire meant the torch, and Chris was just saying he did not like this, that it seemed too suspicious. I was kind of weirded out a bit too, but Jordan seemed interested in it, and I didn't want to seem scared to him. Plus, it was the most interesting thing to happen all night in this boring town. There was nothing around the torch, though it was literally just dug into the center of the backyard. There was a small wooden shed by the corner of the clearing, and in the other corner were a bunch of tools and wood scattered around the grist. Now, Jordan tried leading us closer to the woods, but I was with Chris now. I was pushing for Jordan to just leave now, as if it was too weird and creepy to be looking for candy in the stranger's backyard. He kept telling me, hang on one more minute while we take a look, and we started to look around and examine the place. The house had an old, dirty look to it, surely a very low-income home. I started to examine the windows. One of them was cracked, the other had blinds closed, and when I looked up at the upstairs window, there was somebody looking down at us, specifically at me. When he or she noticed me, they moved away from the window and shut the blinds. I told told Jordan we should go. I looked over the window of the wooden shed and I could see someone poking their head out there ever so slightly. I grabbed Jordan, yanking him to follow me, but he was frozen still. He was looking up at the woods. I looked to see what he saw, and it was a person coming up from the woods. Jordan was laughing. I guess he thought it was supposed to be a part of this spooky setup. I watched with him until we saw the person come into light wearing a genuine, horrific mask, and there was something in his hand, a machete. Jordan still thought it was a joke. Even Chris seemed to be laughing a bit, till I started to think it was all just a nice little Halloween setup until the person wearing the mask charged at Jordan and swung the machete, only he missed as Jordan backed up in time. We all sprinted back out front where we saw somebody blowing out the torches. He spotted us and started chasing us as we ran all the way down the dirt road, back down the paved road, and made it back to my house. Jordan was throwing up. I'm not sure if it was because of running so much or because of the fact that he almost lost his life. He told my parents right away. My dad called the police and asked him to come to the house. My dad then drove us to the house where it happened with the police following us. By the time we got there, everything was gone, and by everything I mean the notes, the torches, the candy bucket. The house had been vacant for months. Nobody was living there. It was the perfect place to set up a murder scene. We requested the police to go inside to check, as I did spot somebody spying on us from upstairs, but it turned out they were gone as well. We did the best we could to describe what had happened and the people I saw. I believe one of the officers told my father that they would investigate further into this and thanked us for the info. Maybe you don't realize how sick this world is full of insane, scary, messed up people until you actually come into encounter with them. Last Halloween, I was asked to chaperone my little brother Kevin, my little cousin Mike, and his friends while they trick-or-treated. Now, I wasn't the typical cliched teenager that was pissed off because I had better things to do. I was perfectly content with hanging out with my little brother and my little cousin and his friends. I was 18 years old, so I was a bit old to actually be collecting candy myself, so I asked my little brother to carry a smaller bag and put some candy in there for me at each house. By the time that small plastic bag was filled, I was asking the kids if they were ready to go home, and every time I would ask, they would say, no. They insisted on filling their bags to the top. But that was out of the question. I had enough, so I started leading them back into the direction of Mike's house. Suddenly, a white van pulled up next to the driver, rolled down the passenger side window, and asked me if I could help him out with something. Nah, I gotta get these kids home, I said as I directed my attention back to the group. He said he just needed me to fix his passenger seat into the upright position as it was a two-person job, and he said he had a date. I told him it would have to be real quick. He parked his car and told me to get inside. I opened the door and began fidgeting with the seat. He was telling me to lift, and then I would lift. He would then put it back down. I'm going to be honest, I thought this guy was just flat out dumb until I heard the kids screaming outside. There was somebody trying to grab one of Kevin's friends. I almost fell on my face as I tried to get out of the van. When I did, I grabbed him by the throat and began to strangle him. The driver came out and shoved me to the floor and attempted to grab Kevin, but the owner of the house we were in front of came out front with a rifle in his hand and fired a shot in the air as a warning shot. And with that, the two creeps hopped back in their van and drove off. I tried to grab a hold of one of them, but I wasn't quick enough. The van was gone down the street before I could even take 5 steps after getting up. I couldn't express enough gratitude for that old man who came out with his rifle. I wish I could say the story ended there happily. But unfortunately, the next day, while watching the news, there was a report of a missing 9-year-old boy in our town. Now, I usually believe in coincidences, but I know that wasn't any coincidence. And I know for the rest of my life it will kill me remembering how I could have prevented a kidnapping had I just grabbed a hold of one of those guys. I was with my 3 friends, John, Mary, and Keenan. Since we didn't have any real plans and were kind of just hanging around, I decided to grab the Ouija board from my closet. All my friends were down to try it. I wanted to be funny, but also set the mood, so I got 3 candles, lit them, and turned off all the lights, and the 4 of us sat at the table with our hands on the planchette. We started off by saying, "Is anyone there?" Of course, the planchette started to move, and we all started to laugh. It went from Y to E to S, spelling yes. John and I began asking the really stupid, goofy questions like, "Will you haunt Mary?" And she kept begging us to stop, but as the planche had moved to once again spell out the word yes, we all erupted into laughter. To be honest, I didn't even contribute to moving the piece around the board. I just assumed John and Keenan were messing around for the most part. And without anyone asking a question, the planchette started spelling the words, "I'm inside the house." More laughs until there was a huge, very obvious thump sound from directly upstairs, like right over our heads. It most closely resembled a boot stomping on the floor. All of us jumped. Mary started screaming and freaking out. John, Keenan, and I didn't know whether to laugh or be freaked out. My parents weren't home. I wasn't expecting anyone. We didn't have any pets. Suddenly the doorbell rang. We looked at each other. Then I went to look through the peephole. I opened the door. It was a dad and his young son trick-or-treating under an umbrella. I opened the door and handed the kids some candies, but once I shut the door, it was back to the current reality of the situation, which was figuring out what the hell that sound was. I convinced all 3 of them to come upstairs with me just to check. We all got to the upstairs hallway, and all that was on was a nightlight plugged into the floor outlet. We were halfway through the hallway, approaching my parents' bedroom, when the room directly above the table we were sitting at, where we heard the noise. Now, that's when we all heard the same thing. It was this voice of a girl. What she said, none of us could hear, but all of us agreed we heard the voice of a girl in my parents' room, followed by the sound of something being dropped on the floor. Mary and Keenan ran down the stairs, freaked out, but not making a peep. John and I, however, approached the door. I opened it quietly and pushed it open slowly. I looked into the dark room and I saw something tall standing in the far corner of the room. I slammed the door shut and we ran downstairs. We stayed in the living room and flicked on the lights, and then noticed one of the candles by the Ouija board was blown out. I called the cops, and a few minutes later, when an officer arrived, I asked him to check my parents' bedroom. I led him to the stairs and pointed at the door. He knocked on it and announced police, then opened the door quickly and flicked on the light. He checked the closet under the bed, nothing. That's when we followed and entered the room as well, and I can confirm no one was in there. While we were at it, we checked every single bedroom and bathroom up there, and not a single possible place anybody could be hiding. After the police officer left, we threw the Ouija board in the neighbor's garbage, and we all sat under the awning of the backyard, listening to the storm in silence until my parents returned. After telling the story to my parents together, eventually my friends left. My parents seemed to believe us, but what could they really do? I didn't sleep too well that night, and I obviously had no plans of using a Ouija board ever again.
The night before Halloween of 2006, I was walking down the sidewalk to my friend's house. As I was making my way down the sidewalk, I saw something moving across the street, a little ways in front of me. I wasn't too familiar with the Halloween movies at the time, but I did recognize a Michael Myers mask as I watched the figure walk into the front yard of a house that was just on the other side of the street. It then stopped, looked in my direction, and then turned and kept walking across the front yard. I was more weirded out than afraid. I figured this guy must have been someone who lived there and was playing a practical joke on someone. I continued to my friend's house and eventually forgot all about it. The next morning I was waiting for the school bus to come pick up me and my sister. It was still pretty early in the morning. Fog was rising up from the grass and the frost was slowly melting off the windshields of some of the nearby parked cars. I was just wandering up and down the sidewalk when I saw the Michael Myers guy again. This time, he was directly across the road, standing between two garages and looking my way. I pointed him out to my sister, but he was standing so still that we assumed that he was some kind of Halloween decoration. I was tempted to call out to him, but I decided against it. And even in my 12-year-old mind, I felt genuine alarm that an adult could walk around with a mask on this early and stare at someone else's children. It wasn't until I was on the bus that the figure finally moved. I tried to point him out to my sister, but the bus was already moving and he was out of sight. That night was Halloween, and my sister and I went out dressed as Ash and Misty, and my father accompanied us, occasionally saying, "He got you," in a really loud and squeaky voice when other people were close by to embarrass us. It wasn't until we were on our way home that I saw Michael Myers again. He was walking down the side of the road behind us. Other people were walking by him without even reacting. I tried to point him out to my father, but he barely looked twice at the figure. When we got home, I watched from my bedroom as the figure stood outside our front lawn. He waited there for a few minutes before disappearing around the side of our house. Now I was starting to get nervous. I asked my dad if one of his friends was messing with us, and I begged him to take a look outside. But he came back a minute later with a completely carefree attitude, saying there was no one there. Later that night, my sister crept into my room and whispered that there was someone outside of her bedroom window. Instead of calling out to my parents, who were both asleep, I grabbed my flashlight and I followed her back to her room. I told her not to turn on any lights, and when we got to the window, I turned on the flashlight and shone the beam directly into the face of Michael Myers. He was standing directly outside, peering through the window. His hands were cupped against his eyes to help him see inside. When the light hit him, you would think he would have bolted, but instead he remained motionless. He opened his hands and slapped the window hard enough to knock a framed picture off the wall. I screamed like I was being eaten by a shark. The figure then put his right index finger up to the lips of his mask, as if telling me to shush. He then vanished into the darkness. My father then burst into the room, and we both started crying as we told him what we saw. The cops were called, but they took their time getting there, obviously not very concerned that it was another Halloween prank. And had we not seen the stranger before that night, I may have believed that too. The neighborhood was searched, but no one wearing a Michael Myers mask was found. This upcoming Halloween will be my 40th birthday, and even after nearly 25 years, the terrifying memory of that night has never faded. You see, I lost my virginity in a pumpkin patch on Halloween. I know, cliché. Specifically, I lost it in the bed of a pickup truck while it was parked in the pumpkin patch. To give you an idea of the patch, it was maybe 80 by 100 feet and fenced off by a wire mesh to prevent cows from getting in. The truck was parked just inside the only gate. Myself and my date had settled there right before the sun went down. My house was just across the street from the pumpkin patch. We shared a bottle of wine, awkwardly talked for a while, and then got to business. My family and I had 2 border collies, and as we were changing positions, the dogs have wandered in and started barking at us. My date and I paused and drunkenly, playfully began throwing scraps of food out into the pumpkins for them to chase. After a couple minutes of that, we continued right where we left off. After we were done, we sat there in the truck and looked up at the stars while the dogs wandered off around sniffing random things. After a short while, I saw my father return home, pulling into the driveway across the street. The dogs bounded out of the patch towards him, and me and my date quickly began to dress ourselves. Once we were fully clothed, we just sat on the tailgate and kept talking as we watched my dad pet the dogs and then go into the house. It was about then when we heard it, a rustling sound coming from the patch somewhere behind us. We both paused and turned. At this point, there was only moonlight to illuminate our surroundings, but it was enough. And this is exactly what we saw. A single pumpkin began to rise up out of the patch, but not like someone was lifting it. It was kind of sideways, like it had been resting on its side, and now it was sitting up. For a split second, I thought that someone was raising this pumpkin out of the patch on a stick or a metal bar. But then the stick changed position. It coiled like a snake and then shot straight up like a man would if he went from a squatting position to a standing position. I then saw 2 spindly legs with knee joints protruding from the thing, but no arms. There was a buzzing in my ear, and all of a sudden my date screamed. We both jumped off the truck and booked it out of the patch and sprinted towards my house. I glanced back once, and I'll swear on whatever you want me to swear on. A tall, skeletal figure was leaning over the truck, where we had just both been sitting, and I caught a glimpse of 2 beady red eyes staring back at me. We made it to my garage and forced our way in through the kitchen door. I began screaming at my dad to get his gun. It wasn't until I saw the blood on the kitchen floor that I realized that my nose had been bleeding. Even more alarming, my date's nose was gushing blood as well. I told my dad that there was something in the pumpkin patch. He grabbed his gun and power walked out of the house, the dogs following closely behind him. but they stopped when halfway there, refusing to come any closer to the pumpkin patch. When my dad returned, he was livid. He wanted to know what had damaged the fence and broke the tailgate off of my truck, which technically was his truck. I could only shiver in confusion and abject terror. He reported that something had ripped the tailgate right off my truck and then tore out of the patch from inside and destroyed a huge section of fence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I cowered in terror in the living room with all the lights on. The next day, the police came to examine the scene. The wire fence had been torn out of the ground and dragged a short distance away, and there was no clear indication of what specifically had done it. My father and the police were convinced that it was a trespasser pulling a Halloween prank, but I never believed that for a moment. I tried to explain that the dogs had been pounding through the patch just 2 minutes before the thing had appeared, and neither of them had made a sound to alert us that there was a trespasser nearby. Furthermore, the entry gate to the patch made plenty of noise whenever the wind rattled it, so if someone climbed over it, it would make even more noise, and we had been sitting right by the gate. Another thing that terrified me was the shape of the thing as it stood. Even if it was a trespasser with an elaborate costume, none of that would even begin to explain the tailgate, the destroyed fence, the nosebleeds, and our dogs being too nervous to approach the patch, or the eyes that I had caught a glimpse of. And my father went to his grave believing that he had been vandalized by trespassers. My date and I concluded later that whatever it was, it hadn't been human or an animal. I don't tell the story often because I mostly get the same Charlie Brown joke. It was the Great Pumpkin, so no one really takes me seriously. But I've heard that skinwalkers can take the form of anything that best suits their surroundings. Our property wasn't anywhere near a Native American reservation, but I can't think of anything else that it could have been. So what do you think it was? It's been 10 years since I've spoken about this incident. On Halloween of 2009, me and my younger sister, along with a couple of our friends, went out trick-or-treating. I was only 8 years old at the time. My younger sister was 5. My best friend's older brother was 17, and it was his responsibility to look after us that night. This took place in London, and at the time we hardly had any crimes in our area. The night went off without a hitch, and we were all planning on calling it an evening. Since we had collected enough candy, my best friend's older brother was just about to call my dad. But before he could dial the number, he received a call from my dad. He let him know where to come and pick us up, and after a few minutes, my dad came and collected me and my sister. We said goodbye to our friends and thanked them for a fun evening. As my dad was driving my sister and I back home, he seemed on edge. Now, since I was only 8, I kept babbling on about how much candy we had collected and how we couldn't wait to get home to eat them. My dad wasn't listening. He just looked really anxious about something. As soon as we got back home, I entered my house to find my mother, my aunt, and my cousin sitting around the living room. I greeted them, and my mother hugged both me and my sister. My dad set us down and told us that we could never go out trick-or-treating ever again. Now, because I was 8, I began throwing a tantrum, complaining how I loved Halloween and that my parents were being unfair. My little sister was too young to even care. She was too busy going through the candy that we had just collected. So after 2009, me and my sister never went out for Halloween. We didn't bother throwing a tantrum since we knew it would be pointless. However, in 2012, my brother was born, and last year in 2018, he turned 6. My father finally relented and agreed to take my little brother and sister out trick-or-treating. By this time, Halloween had lost its appeal for me, and I didn't want to go out anyway. My little brother gets his way since he's the youngest, and he loves Halloween. I decided to ask my mom why she didn't allow me and my sister to go out on Halloween after 2009. She sighed and explained to me that a boy from our area had gone out trick-or-treating in the same area. He was with his friends, but had somehow separated from the group. He ended up knocking on the door of an old house that was located at the end of a quiet street. I'll spare you the gory details, but the boy's body was found in the house after several people heard screaming and called the police. The boy's arm had been removed from his body, and he died from blood loss. The police had been going door to door and warning parents about what happened, and that's when my dad came and collected us. My mother told me that they arrested an old mentally deranged man in connection with a crime, but Halloween would never be the same again for my neighborhood. I had heard rumors about a boy who was killed on Halloween at my school, but I never took it seriously. I thought it was just a local urban legend, but now I understood why my dad looked so worried that night. The house where the boy was found, which is only a few blocks away from mine, now sits abandoned with its windows boarded up. People around here jokingly refer to it as the Myers house. Halloween is pretty much ruined for me. I'll be staying home again this year. However, my brother, who's now 7, can't wait for Halloween. I just hope my dad keeps a close eye on him. Halloween used to be one of my favorite holidays. Now I kind of just enjoy it when I have a decent party to go to. In 2018, when I was a senior in college, my friend Tracy's sorority was going to be throwing a big Halloween party at the sorority house. She said I could bring one friend since they didn't want too many outsiders at the party. So I invited my best friend Cody. We are very last-minute people when it comes to Halloween costumes. The party was that night and we didn't have anything. Cody was working late, so he'd have to meet me right before the party. So he asked me to go get a costume for him, and he'd just Venmo me the money. I ran to the nearby Spirit Halloween store that opened up like 5 minutes from my house. I was just shotgunning it. I picked up Where's Waldo costume for myself and a Superman costume for Cody. Both 2 of the cheaper costumes they had. Everything was normal until I got to the cashier. I was on the phone with Cody telling him about the costume I had got him and giving him the details about the party. I told him which sorority it was that Tracy got us the invite, gave him the address, and then he convinced me to pick him up instead of just meeting. Stuff like that. All this was said as the cashier was watching me. He was some guy who was decently older than me, but because of his receding hairline, I couldn't quite gauge as to whether he was in his late 30s or low 40s. He wore glasses though, and had a skinny-ish build and an awkward presence. As he rang up the 2 costumes, he had a comment, something along the lines of, "Sounds like a fun party tonight, huh?" I chuckled and said, "Yeah." Then he started asking more details, like if it's an open invite. I said, "It's closed invite and that I barely got an invite." He said, "It's all good." Then he shook my hand and introduced himself as Mike, so I did the same, and I told him my name was Sean, and I left. It was weird. Fast forward to later that night, I picked up Cody and we arrived at the party around 10 p.m. It sounded loud inside, and there were multiple groups of people entering the house before we were at the door. A girl asked us who we knew there, and I told her Tracy, and she let us in, and we were in this huge living room area. Music blasting, all the lights dimmed low, Halloween decorations everywhere, and to top it off, people with red cups full of booze crowding the place. We saw Tracy and hung around her for a while. We played beer pong and other drinking games. It was a very legit party. But then at some point, there was a commotion at the front door area. Cody, Tracy, and I and a few others walked over, and the girl at the door started yelling out, "Where's Tracy?" She came forward, and the girl asked, "Who is Sean?" I said, "I am." Then she asked me who that creepy guy we invited was. I was confused and I said, "Who?" She described some older-looking man in a cowboy costume with a fake mustache. He apparently inappropriately touched one of the girls, trying to get her into a separate room, and she screamed for help. Then he took off with something in his pocket. None of the guys chased after him or anything. Immediately, I thought of the cashier from Spirit Halloween. I told them about it, and everyone got even more creeped out. The party went on, but they were a lot more cautious about who they were letting in. They even considered calling the cops for a second. That whole thing really killed my vibe, and we didn't stay much longer after that. In total, we were probably at the party for a couple of hours at most, and we left a little past midnight. I think I didn't drink much. As I started my car, the car parked like 2 cars behind us also turned on theirs. And as I drove in the direction of Cody's house, the car started to follow. Cody and I were sure it had to be him after it made 4 of the same turns. So I pulled to the side of the road, egging him to pull over. But the car just stopped for a few seconds, then basically floored it past us. We didn't get a good look at who was inside, but I'm still positive it was him. After dropping off Cody down the block from his house, just being cautious, I was staying very aware of my surroundings. And because of that, I noticed a car in the near distance with its lights off, telling me it looked like the same car. I got to a main road once again, pulled over and waited. And the car, once again, waited. Then a few seconds later, turned on its lights and floored it in the far left lane, passing me. I was obviously shook and drove home as fast as I could while I was sure I wasn't being followed. I called that Spirit Halloween location the next day and reported the cashier. They thanked me for the information, but I never went back there, so I wouldn't know if he was fired or anything. Looking back, I wonder if I could have and should have pressed charges. Regardless, I have no idea what he could have possibly wanted from me, but either way, I'm happy he didn't find out where I live. Halloween of 2019 was the most terrifying night of my life. I live in Australia, and because we don't celebrate Halloween as enthusiastically, we don't get as many trick-or-treaters around. Around 5 or 6 people at the most. I am personally a huge fan of Halloween, though to the dismay of my parents who would prefer not to acknowledge it. Obviously, that leaves me in charge of putting up decorations and handing out candy. This particular year, Halloween fell on a school night, and a storm began just after 6 o'clock, which unfortunately meant my efforts preparing the decorations had pretty much gone to waste. So, ignoring my better judgment, I still waited for trick-or-treaters in the living room and watched The Conjuring to pass time. Around an hour and a half later, I got a message from my friend Em on our group chat, asking if anyone would like to mess around and go trick-or-treating. At first I was confused. We hadn't gone trick-or-treating in over 5 years, but I decided it would make the night more enjoyable, as nobody was knocking on the door anyway. My other friends, who I'll call S, C, and H, all agreed, and asked them where we should meet up. M quickly replied he couldn't make it, which is strange because he was the one who offered to go trick-or-treating, but he suggested a house with lots of candy. Me, S, C, and H all arrived at the house within a half an hour. A large table with a pumpkin bowl filled with lollipops stood on the front porch, and after checking the windows to make sure we weren't being watched, we emptied the ball between us, leaving only a few to avoid suspicion. As we turned around to leave, we were greeted by 2 men dressed as clowns approaching us in the driveway. They had huge painted smiles and tilted heads, and I could tell we were all creeped out. One of my friends screamed as they started bolting towards us, one squeaking a rubber nose as they chased us. After running for what felt like an eternity, we finally lost them. We decided to go to M's house so we could discuss what had just happened in a safe area. However, when M answered the door, he burst into laughter. "What the hell are you guys doing?" he said, confused. "You told us to go out trick-or-treating. Can you just let us inside?" S replied. After sitting down on M's couch, we all soon realized M had lost his phone earlier that day, and a stranger had suggested the idea of going to that house, presumably some sort of trap from the clowns. After another half hour, I cautiously made my way home by 9:30, finished my movie, and went outside to collect the candy bowl I set up. I was shocked to see the bowl was completely empty. However, my stomach turned when I saw a clown nose that was now laying inside of it. I told my parents everything that happened and showed them the clown nose that had been left at our house. They assured me that it was just some Halloween prank. I woke up around 1 a.m. to noises coming from my bedroom window like rocks hitting the glass. Although I was scared half to death, my curiosity got the better of me. I eventually opened the blinds. My Halloween decorations were destroyed and littered the ground below. I stared motionless, in complete shock, until a lollipop was thrown at the window, breaking my trance. I looked up and I saw them. The 2 clowns perched upon my neighbor's roof looking down at me. I screamed and ran away towards my parents' room. I'll skip the details that followed, but the police were called and the clowns were not found. The officers informed us that they would check the house my friends and I had trick-or-treated at, and they left in about a half an hour. The following morning, we were told the house was abandoned, and M's phone was discovered inside. That day at school, I had learned M, S, C, and H all had creepy experiences during the night as well. I'm not sure if the clowns followed us home or they somehow tracked us through M's phone. All I know is that Halloween is only a few weeks away, and I'm completely terrified they'll return. Hello everyone. For the month of October in 2016, I worked at Party City as a seasonal job. It was pretty hectic for the Halloween season, obviously. I got stuck on the night shift on weekends since I didn't have early classes. The location I worked at changed its closing hours on weeknights to 11 p.m. during the Halloween season. My shift would start usually at 5, and I'd work till close, and the rush would die off after 9. After 10, there would be hardly anyone left in the store, especially on weekdays. On my shift in the day in question, I started work at what was referred to as a costume grabber. I would be told on walkie-talkie what costume and what size to grab so that I could hand it to the customer and they could try it on. After it quieted down and later on in my shift, I was told to start cleaning up the aisles and restocking, and bringing stuff from either up from or down to the basement. That got tiring quickly, because it was a lot of walking up and down stairs. Past 10, there were only about 4 of us still working. A girl named Maria working the cash register, Kyle cleaning up the aisles and stocking, Ashley, the supervisor for the night shift, and then me, the back and forth basement work. The basement was at least connected straight to the upstairs costume storage room. so it wasn't a super long walk from the basement. I took a 10-minute breather and then went to continue lugging boxes from the basement up to the costume storage room. The lights of the basement had been recently turned off by someone. I figured Ashley, so I flipped the light switch back on, and down into the basement I went. As I was lifting a box of girls' costumes, I heard something fall on the other side of the basement. Not to make you think this basement was really big, it was just one big circle full of boxes, with a big shelf in the middle. I put down the box I was holding and slowly peered my head around the shelf. There was someone in a white hooded robe costume and a scary monster mask. Of course, I jumped back at first. Then I laughed, saying, "You got me." Whichever of my coworkers was in the costume didn't speak though. They just tilted their head to the side a bit, as if they were still messing with me. I had a feeling it was Ashley at first, even though she would supervise. Some nights, she was a clown. But then I realized this person was way too tall to be Ashley, so it had to be Kyle. I tried approaching him to remove the mask, and he just backed away from me though. Then I looked down at the boots on his feet. They were dirty, heavy work boots that I knew for a fact Kyle wasn't wearing. I started getting shivers and I went back upstairs without running to avoid suspicion. I shut the basement door and went straight to Ashley, who was talking to Maria by the register. I asked, "Where's Kyle?" And he literally called, "What's up?" from a nearby aisle. That's when panic set in. I asked if there was anyone working that night, and she said everyone went home. So I told her someone was in the basement in a costume who didn't belong there. Kyle and Ashley came with me to the basement so I could prove it to them. But like any cliche horror scenario, whoever was down there was gone. There was a back exit in the upstairs costume room for unloading truck shipments. It was possible that the intruder exited through there. Ashley sped through the security footage of the past hour and didn't see anyone enter the costume room, except for me. But there wasn't a camera in the basement, or the actual costume room itself. Part of me felt like it was a prank, and that if I went back down there I'd find the person in the costume again. But my job was my job, and I had to get back down there to continue stalking the costume room. When I got back down there, I once again picked up a box of girl costumes I originally was trying to bring up, got it upstairs and stopped, because I thought I may have heard the noise of a small plastic bag being slightly crumpled. Of course, I didn't want to stay down there to find out alone. I wasn't getting paid enough. My shift was almost over, so I lugged the heavy box upstairs, dropped it in the costume room, and went back to the basement door to shut the light off. Before I did, I looked down the staircase, and at the bottom is that person in the white robe costume again, only this time with no mask. I saw his smiling face looking up at me. I slammed the door shut and ran out to Ashley and the rest, screaming for help. They came as fast as they could to the costume room, but the back door inside the costume room was as wide open as the basement door. This time, for real, he was gone. The one camera on the outside delivery area didn't even catch him. I don't really know if that intruder managed to steal anything other than the costume he was wearing. For all I know, it could have been just one big Halloween prank, or he might have been there looking to actually hurt someone. For all I knew, it was an armed robber though, and I treated the situation as though my life were in danger. Did you like this story? Check out our channel for more.